Hi, and welcome back to Barely Researched Facts. Today's episode is slightly different from our other episodes this season in its structure. We've collaborated with Payal Shah, who runs the amazing Kobo Fermentary, which is basically your one-stop dream destination for any fermenting questions. Payal is this fountain of fermenting knowledge, and every conversation with her has just been fascinating for both Shar and me. Our collaboration is a 3-part collab. Part 1 is already out. Shar wrote this amazing, insightful piece on Kobo Fermentary and Payal and her work with it, and this went out in our newsletter, probably relevant, a few weeks ago. There's some history, there's a bunch of random facts, there's a bunch of deeply thought through opinions. It's basically everything you love about BRF in an article, so I absolutely recommend reading it. If you haven't and you're trying to figure out where it is, you can go onto the ArtNowThus Instagram page and you will find it there in the bio, or you could read it on our website www.artnowthus.in. Also, while you're there, you should just totally subscribe to the newsletter and get all of this fabulous content in your inbox directly. Alright, so that's part 1. Part 2 is, well, welcome to part 2. Part 2 effectively does not feature Payal, but it does set the stage for Ferment, quite literally. With our word for this episode, Ferment. Shar and I do the usual, giving you a bunch of bizarre, random, fascinating facts about Ferment, and I have made the best pun of my life. I'm not even kidding. Listen to the episode for that alone. As for part 3, I will come back to that at the end of the episode, so listen in and I'll see you guys on the other side. Also, a note before you jump in, the episode that you're going to hear is a little bit more roughly edited than our other episodes, and that is because Mohit, our editor, has been a bit under the weather for the last few weeks. He is better now, he's back to work soon, and we will be back to Mohit quality edited episodes from the next time onwards. But enjoy the show for now.
So when we chose the word for this episode, I really wanted to talk about something that I hadn't really researched before. Like, you know, we all have a basic understanding of how like wine and whiskey and kombucha and sauerkraut and kimchi and all of these things work. So I found this really interesting, I wouldn't even say it's a fact, it's just like interesting information about the Inuit, which is, they were initially they were known as like Eskimo, but that now, after much research, I have found out that that's a derogatory term that was assigned to them by colonizers.
White people?
I guess you could say that. And so they are the indigenous population in the Arctic region, and that spans a ton of countries like Alaska, Canada, all the way to Denmark and Greenland. So the word Inuit is given to themselves by these people, so it's much better than that word that I shall not say again, and it means the people in the Inuit language of Inuktitut. So cute.
Oh,
if I'm getting the pronunciations wrong with the large population of Inuit that listen to our podcast, please correct me. And the singular of Inuit is Inuk. So I could talk a lot about just generally this indigenous peoples, but I want to talk about their diet and their food because we're talking about fermenting, right?
Yeah.
So the diet on the east coast of Greenland in like the 1800s or even the late 1800s closely resembled like the original Inuit diet, and it's 45% protein energy and 55% fat energy. They have absolutely no room for carbohydrates in their diet. They barely eat any vegetables because obviously like the land doesn't permit it.
Who likes vegetables anyways?
Also that. So fermenting, obviously, because of the harsh land conditions and harsh climate conditions, becomes one of the foremost ways to like preserve food and eat it when the winter months are less forgiving. So I want to preface this by saying that I know that we're going to have like some reactions to these foods, but just know that we're like, it's unusual for us, and that's why we're reacting the way we are. I'm going to speak for Ragini here. So, to give you a little context to this fermented food that I'm going to talk about next, Nud Rasmussen, he was a grizzled adventurer who explored Greenland by dog sled in the early 20th century, and obviously this man survived like all kinds of like weather, wildlife.
Attempts on his life by Mother Nature, basically.
Yeah. And he met his end after he ate a traditional Inuit dish called kiriak, which I'm going to go into a little bit now if you want to know more about it. Kiviak is an Inuit delicacy, and it consists of the process of stuffing these small black and white seabirds called auks, 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 into a disemboweled seal carcass. And in some descriptions, I've read it as freshly disemboweled seal carcass. And so this is the process. You take all these seabirds whole, like with their skin on and things, and you pack this seal, like you push up to 300 to 500 birds into this one carcass, and you make sure that there's absolutely no air. So every time you put like a bird in, you like press
it's a vacuum
down.
seal.
And that's it. That's where our episode ends.
That's the fact.
So the vacuum seal, oh my god, I love it, Ragini. So this seal carcass is stuffed to the full to the brim, and all the air is taken out, as Ragini has pointed out, and it's turned into a vacuum seal. And then you take all the openings essentially, and you sew them closed so that it's sealed, further sealed, and then you cover these these sewed parts with seal blubber to prevent flies from laying their eggs and maggots and things like that. Though I love how the description that the Inuit lady, the Inuk, microbiologist whose research, what I'm talking about, is based on, she just said, well, it's all right if you have some eggs, it's fine, you can just brush them off. But it's only if you prefer not to have them. So you then cover this seal, this packed seal, vacuum seal, with rocks, and then depending on the climate, it can take up to 6 months for it to ferment. And how you check is you just take a sniff. You use the aroma to determine, so you use the aroma to determine whether or not the kiviak is done. And the reaction to this type of food, obviously from the rest of the world, like this microbiologist, she's mentioned of how, there's only a couple of sources online of people reacting to this, and generally it's not favorable and it's called grotesque and gross and blah, blah, blah. But obviously we're not here to shame people about the food that they eat. We're here to just talk about how interesting it is, because it is weird, to say the least. But they have been doing this.
For me, the idea of eating fermented meat is... Pickled meat is different. That's fine.
Yeah, dried meat, cured meat, it has a different connotation, because I suppose we're used to it.
I know enough people who haven't eaten a lot of cured meat and feel like the smell is too much, they find it sickening. Pickled. So it's I get the fact that I guess we're just those people when it comes to this.
We don't mind. Would you try some kiviak?
No. I couldn't. And I will tell you why later. Because I've actually seen a few videos of people eating. It's hard to stomach.
Okay, that's fair. That's that's a choice. That's fine. I might try.
Really? Wow.
Yeah, I might try. I'll try it. And so anyway, so then I wanted to also mention another type of food.
Did this guy die after eating it though?
Yeah, he did, unfortunately. So the problem with kiviak is that because the recipe, quote unquote recipe, is so particular, and because the fallout is so serious, if you don't do it properly, you could get botulism, which is caused by a bacteria that seals have. You could get botulism, you could get food poisoning, you could get very serious food poisoning, and you could definitely die. There have been cases every year. There are a few cases of people dying from kiviak in wherever it's made. Yeah.
See, that's another reason I won't try it.
It's extreme. It's any other. It's like eating any other seafood that's poisonous if it's not cooked properly. Even prawns, if you don't remove the intestinal tract, then you're asking for trouble, right? So, which brings me to the concept of food sovereignty, which I don't think I'd ever thought of it in terms of that phrase. So, Avyaha, sorry if I'm pronouncing her name wrong, but she mentioned food sovereignty and how Greenland is now being overtaken, obviously, like the rest of the world, with imported food, in terms of if you go to this tiny corner shop in this town in Greenland, you can get grapes from Mexico and kiwis from Chile and things like that, which is sort of replacing the traditional foods that have been eaten for centuries in those areas. And this in itself is like an interesting problem, because obviously in relation the kinds of wildlife that you would eat now as opposed to the kind that you would not, or not wildlife but meat, it all depends on things like species extinction and how you're affecting the biodiversity of where you live and things like that. So it's a discussion that needs to be had by people more clever than me. But the effect that it has in this particular area is that the more that you dilute food sovereignty, the less people will know how the old ways of how to make these foods. And in relation to things like kiwiak, the fallout is serious because you could die. So there is this negative feedback loop where the youth have become alienated from fermented foods in Greenland and across Inuit lands, and then that knowledge disappears, and then it risks people's safety when it comes to like eating, still wanting to eat these types of food but not having enough information to know how to do it properly. So that's one thing that's sort of threatening these old ways of fermenting food. And then another thing we always come back to is climate change. So the traditional things of drying meat like caribou and fish and all of that is being affected obviously by the temperatures. With rising temperatures, the loss of ice cellars, permafrost, new ways of like storing food have to be explored, because sometimes this lady mentioned that if you're drying fish, it cooks before it can dry, which is sad because, you're losing that entire method of preparing food. And this is like super surface level. If you're more interested, we will have the link to the original article in the blog post.
So honestly, I kind of realized when you started speaking, but I think our facts are overlapping a little bit. But I'm going to still talk about mine, because mine is also about fermented meats, and it's really funny because you're actually talking about it in terms of how the traditional method of preparation in certain parts of the world, and how people it's just a lot of cultures have kind of evolved eating, and at the same time, eating fermented meat now has. So I came across this thing where it's apparently the social media phenomena. Okay, so it's become like this trend.
I'm already scared.
So people eat heavily fermented meat. It's called high meat because it apparently leaves you with a bit of a buzz. That's the thing. It's a bunch of YouTubers and stuff who've done it. And the reasons, when you asked me, will you eat the dish? I said no, because I saw a video of this guy eating fermented rotting meat, and it is hard to, at least I couldn't look at it. I couldn't even watch it. It was just,
But is it the same though? Because I feel like that's just a guy who shoved a chicken breast in a container and was just left it. Yeah.
And it was just.
So it's not fermenting. It's like, is it actually rotting meat? It's not fermenting.
So they say that they try and ferment it. At least in the preparations that they've just left it there, they've let it ferment. Again, the same thing, right? Now the same problem is happening is that the logic behind doing this is that it kind of takes you to a more natural diet. So apparently you're still seeing it in Inuit cultures around the world, but like back in the day in the Paleolithic era or whatever, when he prepared his meats were stored, because obviously you went and you hunted once and you stored the meat. And so for olden times, like in earlier, like ancient times, man probably collected the meat and the meat was fermenting, and so it's called a paleo diet. But what I think so that's what they're trying to go back to, this thing. It's a more natural way of eating, it's a healthy way of eating, and apparently it gives you a bit of a buzz, which I don't know if it does or whatever. I guess they do.
I feel like they wanted to get buzzed and then added all this other like information to it, which justifies it.
And it is hard to watch, but also I have to say that when you're talking about the fact that early man ate his meats like that, and you're going back to a more natural diet, we have to also kind of realize that the manner of procuring that meat for them was very different to the way that we procure our meat now, and I feel like this is a big thing that with so many of these things of that's just how it's naturally meant to be. But I'm just like, but you can't just take one part of what it's supposed naturally meant to be like and say everything else is going to be by my super modern processes. And then I'm going to go into a supernatural diet about this one particular thing. So obviously, if you're eating a mince meat and you're fermenting mince meat, you can't say, or cold cuts or whatever. This is not the kind of meat that was available to people millions of years ago, right? So that meat preparation was different. So having said that, I will say that while this is a trend and it's been going around, there is a very, very high risk of falling extremely sick, if not worse. But I mean, your best case scenario also at a point if you're getting sick of like very fermented meat is that you're just, well, in the article that I was reading, they describe it as explosively incontinent, which basically means that you would be stuck with diarrhea for a long time. But one of the reasons why you could potentially be getting high off this meat is because, so according to, again, the same article and according to the publication that I was reading, there could be a delirium that's brought on by having such an upset stomach, and that just gets you a bit high, and that's possibly the reason for the buzz. There's also a chance the bacteria that grows on these meats could then elicit this effect of feeling like slightly high.
I feel like that's not a great trade-off to be extremely sick but
and
also
then just
high.
be like, oh yeah, I'd be like buzzing. I'd be on a bit of a trip.
No, not for me.
Yeah. So there's fermented meat, there's high meat.
Well, that's the thing, right? Fermented meat and rotting meat, the only difference I would say, I'm not a fermentation expert, but the only thing that I would say is that fermented foods promote the growth of good bacteria that's good for your gut and lives symbiotically in your system as opposed to bad bacteria, which makes you sick. So, like I said, I'm not an expert, but we do have an expert on the show.
All right. That's where I'm going to leave this episode off for right now. I think it's fairly obvious what part 3 of our collab is. If you haven't figured it out though, you tune in next week and you'll have all your answers. And if you have, that's all the more reason to tune in next week and join the conversation, enjoy the show. If you do try your hand at some fermenting experiments, send us some photographs. We'd love to compare notes. Thank you for listening to the episode. We'll see you soon. Bye.
Mm-hmm.